My name is Steve Wong, and I'll preface a lot of my life in Sacramento around a couple of issues. One, my father came to this country as a paperson. My mother was pregnant with me when she left Hong Kong to come to the United States in 1948. And I was actually born on the ship, the SS President Wilson. And the ship was in Shanghai. And I became a citizen of the United States because my father was a citizen under false pretenses. And I think in the old days, it's like if you were born in the U.S. or you were born to a citizen, you would become a citizen yourself. All right, which is important because many years later, we found out about our false last name. And interesting enough, at the time, they had an amnesty program. And my father took that so he could be a permanent resident. But in the process of doing that, I also lost my citizenship because it was based on his. So when in junior high school, we changed our name back to our real name, which is Wong. Because at the time, my name was Stephen Kong. And a lot of people at the school remember me having changed my last name, and that was very curious to them what it all meant. And so that was like I don't know, I wouldn't say it's a dramatic point in my life, but it was a interesting turn. And I actually had to go with my father to the post office to, make sure that we had the green card for the year, that kind of thing. Because that's how they did it back then. You had to go to the post office to, register that you were a permanent resident, and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I don't think it affected me in any grand way, but it was interesting kind of like development in terms of my life. And because I went from the middle of the class to the end of the class, and people noticed that. And so Kong became Wong, right, kind of thing. So that was part of, in a certain sense, part of my biographical history. And then I also want to mention the fact that we were born, a whole generation of Chinese Americans were born after World War II because of the War Brides Act and that kind of thing. And it occurred to me the other day that as a grouping of people who grew up during that period of time, we were only 10 years away from the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That we have a very important link to our parents in regards to what they went through, opposing the suppression and the oppression of Chinese Americans. And that we are of a generation that has that link and also had a lot of experiences that our parents had when we were growing up. And that's important, I think, because of the way that we grew up facing the racism provided us with a basis for activism later on in our life. And but it's interesting to note that we are closely tied to the Chinese Exclusion Act, being that most of us was born within 10 years of the repeal, you know. And to me, that's extremely important in regards to like how we saw ourselves and you know, what happened to us as we were growing up, which includes like when we were growing up, we were basically placed in an area which was outside of Chinatown. All the Chinese Americans and the Japanese American all lived in the same area. And if you're from that area, I can assure you that you went to Lincoln School, you know, in that part just outside of Chinatown. And after 55 or 55 and after, with the ignoring of the housing covenants that said that they could only rent to or sell the home to white people, we were allowed, or we were redlined into the southern part of Sacramento, which is, as you see today, even a lot of Chinese Americans still live in that area. And a lot of people grew up there. And I myself and a lot of the other families, we all moved in that direction because they certainly didn't want us in the northern part of Sacramento, which, you know, was extremely white, of course, at that time. And but the south part of Sacramento evidently was deemed okay for a lot of Asian Americans to move into, you know. So and the Chinese community, despite a lot of like, you know, births that were happening after the war, was still, you know, not all that big really, on the smaller side. So everybody knew everybody. And in that regard, you know, having grown up in Chinatown area, we dealt within our community, which basically was like how you put it, like that were just Chinese American and Japanese American. We, you know, at that time, you know, we didn't know any other people, because I don't remember even a single white person that was in any of my classes. I just remember that they were all Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, which could have been true. I don't know if that is really true or not. But then when we finally moved to the south part of Sacramento, you know, we went to schools that actually, because of the lot of Chinese and Japanese Americans who were moved in that part of the country, I mean, that part of the city, there was still quite a few Chinese in our classes and Japanese Americans in our elementary, junior high, and of course, high school, you know. And so in that regard, we were still kind of in a certain sense within our community, because we had the Chinatown area people. You have the First Chinese Baptist Church and other denominations, but you had the associations, and those were like our social contacts of like our parents and ourselves, that we actually probably interacted with these organizations at that time. So in a lot of ways, we kind of just grew up in the Chinese community with all its institutions. So that provided a certain, I guess, like stability and a certain sense of self and your community, because that's how we dealt with it at the time, you know. So, and as we were growing up, you know, a lot of us basically just socialized within our own communities. We didn't have all that much contact with like a lot of the other communities, like the white community in particular. So you can say that we had our own Chinatown in a different way, you know, like San Francisco. But also, Sacramento was known as the second city, second largest like Chinese population outside of San Francisco. So you definitely know that there was some importance to, the larger community of Chinese Americans, because Sacramento was also the starting point for the transcontinental railroad. And so it became a hub for a lot of Chinese Americans. And, people like my parents that were there. And a lot of the Chinese basically worked in restaurant and the canneries. Almost all of the mothers who, came to Sacramento, most of them one time or another actually worked in the canneries. Like my mother, for instance, worked like 30, 40 years in the cannery, and it was unionized, which was a big advance for a lot of the Chinese women. Whereas my dad worked in a restaurant all his life. And our original ancestor in terms of a Wong arriving to the United States, Sacramento was our, in a certain sense, our hometown. And he was involved in the restaurant business. And so my uncles and everybody around there, my cousins, they all worked at a restaurant one way or another. And so I come from a long line of like, restaurant people. And at different times, my father actually had a hand laundry at one time too, because Chinese went back and forth between hand laundries and restaurant and all that kind of stuff. So in regards to Sacramento, a lot of the Chinese men worked in restaurants and some in hand laundry, but the women worked in the canneries. And that's kind of like the environment that we kind of grew up in. And I myself, growing up in the environment, because our parents, these were ways for them to try to get their children educated and not to work and toil in like these really difficult jobs, right? And it sent a lot of people to college, in that regard, in terms of like, how Chinese look at things, that the kids, have to go to college and we will work hard as hell in our restaurant or whatever to send them there. So that's all part of the, in a certain sense, the ethos of the Chinese Americans, and it wasn't just Sacramento, of course, but that was also a very important part of it. And so from very early on, we were told that we had to go to college and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of people did, in Sacramento, a lot of the young people, but also knew that like at the same time, we were facing, like the civil rights movement, the Black liberation movement, and the anti-war movement. And those always made a lot of people think about what was going on in the world. So, and I heard that UC Berkeley was the place to go to because they had demonstrations every day, and so that's where I went after a couple of years at City College. And but also it was the steering of a lot of young people like ourselves at the time about activism and our political changes, political thoughts, and all kind of stuff. And Berkeley seemed to be a good place for a lot of people to go to. And so that's why, I went to Berkeley. But I mean, you could have gone to State College, City College, all that kind of stuff as well. And but it was definitely like something your parents wanted you to do because they didn't want you to have to toil and slave away like they did. Just an example of like the awareness that we were developing as we moved into the southern part of Sacramento was the fact that we moved into a neighborhood. We were only like maybe the fourth or fifth family that was Asian. And so it was a fairly, well, otherwise it was a white neighborhood. However, in the course of a couple of years, all the white people moved out of the neighborhood. You know, kids that we played marbles with over the summer or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. But every single family outside of the Asian and a divorced mother, that kind of stuff, they all left the area. And which says something a lot about, you know, what was happening in Sacramento at the time. And that was also kind of like a lesson. I mean, maybe we didn't recognize it at the time, but in looking back on it, it's definitely like, you know, it gives you a sense of what was going on. That even though, you know, we were allowed to move into South Part Sacramento and because of the ignorance of the covenants, other people, if they couldn't, I guess, deal with the covenants, basically just moved out, you know, into other parts, I suppose, like in the outer parts of Sacramento, you know. So that was an important lesson for, you know, a lot of us, because it was noticeable to me as a child. And I might not have been able to sum it up and understand it all. But it's pretty clear that, like, you know, something was definitely happening in the neighborhood. So a lot of Chicano families, Black families, Filipino families, single moms, fat topic families moved in to replace all these other, you know, people. Just on the 2 blocks that I remembered at that time, that had changed dramatically over that couple of years. So anyway, Sacramento, in terms of the Chinese Americans, as I said before, was a very inclusive community where we dealt with each other a lot because of the times and of the fact that we were people so tied to the Exclusion Act and repeal of it, that even though we didn't know at the time, because actually we probably didn't know anything about the 1882 Exclusion Act to the repeal, and that a lot of the people who had wives that after World War II used the War Brides Act to come to the U.S. and establish families. You know, we have a tie that is like much stronger to our parents and the whole history behind it than to a lot of young people these days who don't have that connection. And the only connection they have is a lot of times is who we are, you know. So they don't have the same experiences that we had, and understanding like how pernicious racism would be upon our lives as we were growing up. But anyway, that's part of like my Sacramento upbringing with a certain preface thing. I think that as we were growing up, you know, we also, you know, experienced, you know, racism in different ways, including things like, you know, I remember as a fairly young kid that people would call us names. And if like one time we were walking along the street somewhere, can't remember where, and we heard like, you know, derogatory terms, and the next thing I knew, a bottle was flying by, and it makes you, you know, aware of like the things around you and the risks that do exist, you know, right? And unfortunately, put it in another context, the racism that our parents experienced, as well as like, you know, that we experienced, I think took different paths in terms of like how our parents dealt with it, or other families dealt with it as well. And I do believe that, after talking with my uh, brother and sister, that when we look back, a lot of the uh, families where the father took out, like the their anger from the oppression onto their children. Where I remember clearly, like this one father, like would slap his sons real hard if he disagree or they did something wrong. And I mean, I talk about like a real slap to the head, that kind of thing. And that to me was a form of abuse that they carried over to like their families. And I think it happened more often than people realize. I mean, I don't think it was like a major issue, but it did. Abuse like that can last a generation or more, and it can create a very dysfunctional families. And which is, as we were talking about, old friends and that kind of stuff, of people where they're at now and what they do, you could definitely see there was like, uh, dysfunctional families that to this day. And like I said earlier, those kind of abuses can, have a very harmful effect on the Chinese Americans, even though, we all had very similar experiences. But at the same time, there are differences in terms of how the parents adjusted to like having kids here and that kind of stuff, because previously, they had no family, right? And how you deal with, unruly kids or whatever can have a direct effect on possible generation or two to come. I think one important thing to mention is that in terms of the growing up in Sacramento and why the Chinese community in a lot of ways was a very inclusive or exclusive, depending on your point of view, but was the food that we ate growing up, and how, for the most part, Chinese Americans probably didn't go to other people's homes in order to eat food, because like dinner was at the table on a nightly basis, and we ate as a family. But at the same time, and I think this is true for a lot of Chinese families, in order to save money, we had gardens that provided a lot of the food that we ate on any particular day, including like, my mother had the winter melon, the fuzzy lemon, melon, bitter melon, the long string beans, tomatoes, celery. No, my mother didn't have celery. Anyway, well, at different times, at different years, she would plant certain things, and those are all part of dinner on different nights, depending on the season. And of course, a lot of it was, during spring and summer months, and including what we call toi gong gang, which is like, the dried bok choy that you hang on the fence, let it dry, you make it into a soup or something like that. Because we're very soup people as well. And this is where my, mom made a lot of like her foods, everything from oxtail to pig snout and all that kind of stuff, right? We use every part of the animal. And but pretty much dinner was at home every night. And I suppose this is probably true for most Chinese families. We didn't go out to eat at other people's places that ever, really. And that's part of just growing up in Sacramento of our generation, And the amazing part of it is like my mother knew how to make all these dishes without any recipes. It was all in her head. And that's an amazing, uh, uh, I think, accomplishment of a lot of mothers, that they can make medicinal meals to, like bak cham gai, the white, cut chicken, to, like many dishes that when you look back on it now, people today have no idea how to make it. And everything from pig's feet to, whatever, CEO guy, soy sauce chicken, all that. They knew how to make all that stuff, and it wasn't on any recipe or any of the sort, which is also true for my dad, because he didn't have any recipe when he ran the restaurant. It was a Chinese American restaurant, and all this stuff that he learned, from working at other restaurants, he applied, and basically what it turned out to be was he was an extremely good cook himself, because he could make American dishes like hamburgers and chicken fried steak, to Chinese dishes like chow mein and chop suey, and sweet and sour pork, all that kind of stuff. But also, like, he was particularly good at making like fried chicken, which people came in a lot for. And he even, like, well, he didn't cater, but people asked for special orders of, like, his fried chicken, along with his lai cheese salad, which was like people ordered as well. But all this stuff is in his head as well, and if you ever notice a Chinese cook in his kitchen, it's very methodical in terms of how they make things. And if like, you have to know something about, he worked primarily in Chinese American restaurants, which is what, a lot of Chinese restaurants at the time were. Half the meals were like in Chinese, and half the, meals are like in American fare. So he was at all that. I thought, when I look back on it now, because there are cooks that, so, but I think my dad was a very excellent cook. He even had specials like beef tongue, that kind of stuff, for a lot of the American customers, because we had a restaurant in an area that was mainly Mexican American. So did very well with that. His restaurant in of itself wasn't all that long, but it was successful enough that he had very good customers who liked his food, that kind of thing. But that's kind of part of like the overall, the work experience and the dining experience of like Chinese Americans at that time, and we ate it basically at home. One of the other aspects of like the inclusive, exclusive Chinese American community where we grew up, as we were growing up, the associations were a very important part of our life in terms of our parents and their connection to it, because for most Chinese Americans who come over here, or Chinese Americans who come over here, they belong to a family association, they belong to a district association, and for the most part, they also belong to a town. And these organizations had a lot of influence on the Chinese community at the time, even though today there's very little influence on that these organizations have on the younger population, and their role has diminished spectacularly, because there's so many other organizations that can do some of the work that they do. Because some of them are like fraternal organizations, and or they're family associations, but they also are fraternal, where it could help out, a Chinese person one way or another. And they were extremely important of us growing up, because they were the places like we went to, like for the Chinese New Year's dinners, autumn festival dinners, any kind of like Chinese celebratory dinners, we would go to either the family association or the district association or even the town for that matter, because they all provided food in terms of banquet type stuff for a lot of, the Chinese community. But the diminished role nowadays, doesn't require that they do any of that stuff actually. And so they were much stronger back then and much more tied to its own community in terms of influence and receptibility of like the people there, around them. But unfortunately, not so true today. Talking about all the associations that were, as we were growing up, from the surname association to the district association to the tongs. Unbeknownst to us at that time, of course, was the fact that they were all heavily Guangwandong or KMT influence and control, because after World War II, after the 1949 revolution in China, the KMT Guangwandong made, I would say, extremely concerted efforts to try to pull the overseas Chinese into their orbit in such a way that like they had strongholds, not only in the United States, but in many other countries where there were these type of associations. And that lasted all the way basically to the starting of the reopening of China, and that we were actually providing a pole for those who like to do China. And in that regard, there was a tremendous amount of struggle that we had, that we start to understand that all these associations were extremely KMT and, reactionary and exploitive of their own communities. And so that was a fight that we had to take on as well in Chinatown as we were developing things. But we didn't know a lot of this stuff when we were growing up. It was because the influence, they, well, for one, never noticed it, but they probably had the KMT flag in the building or outside or whatever. And it made one of the purposes was they were trying to make the overseas Chinese community extremely anti-communist. That was one of their goals, because they hated the communists, of course, because they drove them out of like China onto Taiwan. And so if families growing up in Sacramento probably knew that, and particularly parents, and they took in a lot of the lies and the misinformation that the KMT put out to them. It's almost like everybody has a horror story with the communists. That's why you had to be a KMT person or side with them or be sympathetic to them and all that kind of stuff. And in the course of history, of course, things have changed, of which, we provided a better view of China at the time. The U.S.-China, for instance, the Friendship Association started to rise and opening up China and all that kind of stuff. So that by today, many of these same associations would fly the Chinese flag and not the KMT one. And I think that is a major accomplishment I think we were part of while we were working in Chinatown.